Lisa Landers, the Education Coordinator at the Georgia Historical Society, and welcome to Classroom Conversations with Dr. Stan Deaton. Dr. Deaton is the Dr. Elaine B. Andrews Distinguished Historian at the Georgia Historical Society and the host of the popular series Today in Georgia History, a joint production of the Georgia Historical Society and Georgia Public Broadcasting. In this new series created for the Georgia History Festival, Dr. Deaton and I will discuss how media has become an important part of Americans' daily life. We will describe the development of mass media and its impact over the last 75 years and explore how television and other sources of media have altered the American media landscape by examining its role in major events of the Cold War. Before we begin, I want to thank all of you for joining us today. I'd like to thank our friends and sponsors who have made this and all of our programs possible through their support. A special thanks to Jepson Associates for its support of this Classroom Conversation series, and to the Home Depot Foundation for supporting all of the classroom resources developed for this year's Georgia History Festival. In today's episode of Classroom Conversations with Dr. Stan Deaton, we will discuss the rise of mass media and technologies developed during the Cold War that have made it possible for more information to be shared at faster rates. We will also take a look at how information technologies such as television became popular after World War II and assess the consequences of its impact. So welcome to today's episode, and thank you for being here, Dr. Deaton.
My pleasure. Thank you, Lisa.
All right, great. Well, I'm going to ask you a few questions about this topic, and please just share your knowledge and let us know if you have, any interesting insights.
Okay.
So let's first start talking about what is mass media?
Well, at the most basic level, mass media is simply the ability to communicate with a lot of people at the same time across a very broad area. Think about a network on television or on radio or a newspaper that has a wide audience. Think about the Atlanta Journal-Constitution or the New York Times, the NBC television network. It's simply the ability to communicate with a lot of people across a lot of space.
All right, great. And so if mass media, for example, is something that is at a national level or being able to communicate with a large audience, what are some different types of media that we might see that would fall into that category?
Well, before the advent of television in the late 1940s, Americans gathered around their radios every night and they listened to broadcasts that originated from New York. Usually they listened to the news, they listened to comedies or dramas in the same way we think about watching them now on television. After television, of course, came in widespread in the late 1940s, Americans gathered literally around their television set every night. And they were subject to whatever the networks decided to broadcast. Americans, of course, still listen to their radios and still watch television. But during the Cold War, I would say those two, plus newspapers, usually read by adults, were the primary means of communication.
And how is media different today? What kind of sources of media do we have today that might be different from then?
Well, as you know, now we use our cell phones to communicate primarily, and that's how we individually receive most of our information, whether it's news or entertainment. And we can watch and listen to whatever we want to. We are not subject to whatever a mass media company decides to send out. In 1955, for instance, everybody might have gathered around the TV to watch I Love Lucy or Gunsmoke or to watch the NBC Nightly News. Now, sitting right where you are, you can decide what news you want to read. You can decide if you want to listen to music or if you want to watch a TV show or a movie or even cartoons, whatever it is. So the internet has really changed the way that we take in information and the way that we communicate with each other.
Great. So with the advent of television, as you said, really when it first became popular, there were really only a few channels to choose from. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And I also want to talk a little bit about why television became popular. We're talking about the Cold War. So why did it become popular during the Cold War, specifically after the end of World War II?
Well, television had been around really since the 1920s. It had debuted at the World's Fair in New York in 1939. It didn't become really popular until televisions were mass produced after World War II. By 1960, there were very few American homes didn't have at least one set. So Americans gathered around the set to watch whatever the networks, NBC, CBS, and ABC, decided to broadcast. So if you think of those companies as gatekeepers, literally, they gave you the news, they gave you the entertainment. So whatever they decided to, if you will, feed the American people, that's what it was. These days, there's really very few filters. You can watch whatever you want to on YouTube. But the advent of television was unique in that it brought images into your living room. So you could see presidents and politicians and movie stars and people who sang, like Elvis Presley. Had a tremendous impact on the way Americans saw each other, the way they voted, the way they thought about each other. So it's hard to overestimate the impact television had in Cold War America.
Yeah, and where before the advent of television, you may have only been able to hear these people on the radio, or maybe only see them in images in the newspaper, or maybe in a movie theater if you could afford to go to one. So this is kind of the first time that a large amount of people at once are able to see the images of people from around the country and even the world.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Um,
Again, people like Elvis Presley, for instance.
Absolutely, a super popular figure from that time, and kind of going into that same idea, television is really an American technology, right? And can you talk a little bit about how it was unique to the United States and how that was maybe different than other countries like the Soviet Union, who of course we know is involved in the Cold War with America?
Well, America has a free press, for instance, and totalitarian countries like the Soviet Union under communist rule did not. And so television and media, news industries thrived on television, and they were free to cover all manner of subjects. And so Americans learned about their government. They learned about what was going on locally or at the state level. They could hear and see politicians in their speeches. They could see what was going on in Congress. And in terms of culture, again, television shows like Gunsmoke and I Love Lucy and American media stars like Marlon Brando or Elvis Presley really were sort of imported around the world as part of America's capitalistic brand, if you will, in post-World War II America and the world in a way that communist countries didn't do. We didn't know really what was going on behind the Iron Curtain. They didn't have mass media stars. They didn't have an open news media that could cover what was happening. It was state-sponsored. You got propaganda, basically. And so television was dominated by what we think of as the free world, the free Western Europe and American democracies that also practice capitalism, of course.
And we know there are a lot of really popular cultural figures. You've mentioned several today, like Elvis Presley, during that time period. But another thing that happens with the advent of television, like you just mentioned, is access to our politicians and access to
Yeah.
being able to hear them firsthand and see them firsthand. So one of my questions for you is, does having access to more information, such as being able to hear and see our politicians who may be running for, an election or president or governor, does that really improve society? Does that help us, or is that more harmful to us?
It's a great question. Theoretically, it should improve things because it allows the American people to see and really sort of come into contact with their leaders and potential leaders in a way that they couldn't before when they maybe just read speeches in newspapers or maybe heard them on the radio. But of course, we all know that what ends up happening with the advent of mass media is the soundbite, the commercials. Anyone who turns on the television right now can see a political commercial, and it's usually very short and it just wants to get a short message across. So rather than exploring big issues in depth, what television does is it sort of squeezes these big issues down to almost nothing. Politicians become sound bites, they become faces, and a personal image becomes really more important than issues with the advent of television and mass media, because it's all about how you look and how you sound, not necessarily what you say.
Okay, great. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the impact of television today and how it's changed over time. We've mentioned a couple of times that television only had 3 channels. So that means that we have a small group, or at least a relatively small group of people creating content for people to view, to see on their television, meaning that it's coming from a point of view, their point of view. And we know that there's inherent bias in that. And so how has that changed today? I know you've mentioned a little bit about not having a filter on what you can take in today, but essentially, how are people's lives different before the internet?
Well, when you watch the news in the 1950s, whatever the three channels and their news divisions decided to show you, if there was a scandal in the government, if there was a war somewhere, they could be very particular about how they portrayed those events. You might not know, for instance, when the Vietnam War started, how many Americans were dying and maybe how they were having to fight in a place that was very far away. Most Americans didn't know where it was. Before the internet, you got your news from those three networks, and they were fairly trusted sources. The idea was that they were not going to mislead the American people. They were giving you some version of the truth. Nowadays, of course, with a broad spectrum of places and things to choose from where to get your news, you can choose which political point of view you want. You're not sure if what you're getting is truth. It may be some version of it. It may be a version that you like. It's very different than what Americans had when there were nightly broadcasters who sat as I'm sitting, and maybe they were Walter Cronkite or Chet Brinkley, David Brinkley and Chet Huntley. They were these figures who were sort of national stars. They became very respected, and they were seen as trusted sources of news to tell you what was happening in the world. That's very different from today. We haven't even mentioned advertising, of course, and its impact.
Absolutely. So that kind of leads into a question: should we trust our news?
Well, I think that we still can. In a self-governing republic, we always want to have an informed citizenry, right? We want to have a highly educated, informed citizenry who are eager to find out what is being done in their name, both in their government, by their politicians, by the people that they elect. And having news sources that are trustworthy, who are respected and responsible and trained journalists. With the advent of the internet, anyone with a keyboard and a camera can set themselves up as an authority, right? In much the same way you and I are doing right now. And so it can be very difficult to know if you can trust what people are saying, where they're getting their information. Are they just simply making it up? It's kind of opened up, if you will, a can of worms that just didn't exist in the 1950s. And that didn't mean that everything that broadcasters said then was true, but you simply didn't know and couldn't really change the channel to watch something different or very different if you wanted to.
So it's probably safe to say that in a time period that we call the information age, where we have mass media available to us at our fingertips, that it's important to consider who our sources are and where they're coming from.
That's right. That's right. Are they trusted? Do they have the proper credentials if they call themselves journalist? Or is it somebody literally who's just trying to get you to accept an opinion or a point of view that may not be grounded in reality or facts? It can be very difficult. In the same way that there's a lot of educational information out there now on the internet. In the old days, it would have appeared in a textbook, and you had a reasonable assurance that what you read in that textbook was accurate and true. And so, in much the same way, what's out there on the web is not umpired. It's not refereed. There's no teacher going through and giving it grades. So you just have to be careful about where you get your information and who it is that's giving it to you.
All right, so we're talking about mass media 75 years after the start of the Cold War, the advent of the end of World War II, really launching us into the Cold War. Why does this matter to us?
Well, it matters because it changed everything about American society, from the way that, as I mentioned, we consumed information, where we got our information, the kind of politicians that we elected, and the way that American society operated. Most Americans lived on farms in the 1940s. That began to gradually change as America became more urban, moved to cities, moved into working in factories and in professions. But also, of course, the rise of mass media meant advertising. And so Americans began to buy automobiles and clothing and appliances, and they all began to look and drive and in many ways the same thing. There were mass brands like General Motors and General Electric, and these sorts of things. Americans consuming, buying, much the same way now we just click on Amazon and buy whatever we want. That really came to the fore during the Cold War as advertising was on television, and Americans were heavily influenced by what they saw on television. So coming forward 75 years, the Cold War, the impact of it, both military, politically, economic, social, cannot be overestimated in how it changed American society from before the war to after.
Well, thank you, Dr. Deaton. I really appreciate you answering my questions today. We are going to explore more of these questions and more of these topics, things like news coverage in the Vietnam War. We'll look at bias in advertising. We will even look at the space race and the civil rights movement and how television really impacted those in future episodes of Classroom Conversations with Dr. Deaton. But I just want to thank you for being here with us today and appreciate your support in this. And just one more time, thank you to our sponsors, Jepson Associates and the Home Depot Foundation, for supporting this programming. So thank you all for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.
See ya.